All right, so I want to sort of guide you through what I want from you when you write a philosophical analysis for this class. We're at the page that's located on the top of the schedule page, the link that takes you to the instructions for writing an analytical essay. So this is kind of going to be what I really don't want from you when you write, which is a sort of a rambling and repetitive summary of what I want. But I think it'll be helpful if you stick with it. Sometimes when you just read a document like this, you don't have a real strong sense of what's really important and what's not. So take the time to listen to this, even though it's going to be occasionally kind of boring. Okay, so in the beginning, what I say here is, first you definitely have to read any assigned article many times. I don't give you easy articles. If you've already read this first one, it's not easy to read. That's part of the task is for you to really struggle with and grapple with a difficult article to understand and process. So I'm aware that I'm not giving you a trivial assignment, and I'm aware of how hard it is just to get to the point where you feel like you understand it. It's done perfectly intentionally. Okay, so then it says when you think you understand it, have begun to understand it, select an aspect of the article that you find particularly interesting to talk about. And I say that by an aspect, I don't mean a particular section of it. It could be a section, but I don't mean a particular section. What I mean is a claim or set of claims or an argument that you find interesting and worth analyzing and talking about. The point here really is that you're not responsible for the entire article, and I'll be making this point in a couple of different ways later. Of course, I want you to have read the article and to have understood it in a general way, but your analysis isn't going to tell me everything about the article. What you're doing is focusing on some aspect of the article that interests you, both to summarize and to criticize. Okay, now as far as the basic submission requirements, these are really important in the sense that if you screw any of these up, this means that it's just a red flag. It tells me, gosh, you didn't even take the time to find out the really most basic things, and you'll just get completely hammered for doing that. Okay, so title it correctly. On the top of the article, write analysis of blank by blank, and the analysis of this first blank is going to be the title of the article, and the second blank is not you, it's the author. Okay, I'm going to switch back and forth here between this page and a student journal, an actual student journal from Philosophy 180. So when you write the analytical essay, it should look like this. You'll recall that you're writing on a journal page, which is formatted roughly like this. I'll just be clicking. Let's say this is your first analysis. I'll just be clicking on that, and you'll have pasted or written your analysis in and done it all in a very clean looking way. So don't write your name anywhere here. Don't write your name up here. Your name is already on this journal, so I don't need to see it anywhere else. And I know the date that you submitted it because you will be writing that on the very bottom right here. This person didn't actually do that the first time, but please remember to do that. All right. So also I want your essay to be single-spaced. I know that's an unusual requirement. Again, single spacing, not double spacing. I want the article. I want your essay to be contained in a relatively small space, so that it allows me to put these comments on the side and to be able to see what I'm commenting on. So yeah, do not double space, please. Don't indent the paragraphs. What I want is for you to create a space between each one, just like this student has done, right? So no indentation, space, new paragraph, just like that, okay? Each section of your paper must be preceded by one of these headings: introduction, summary, critique, and conclusion. The conclusion section is an optional section. You don't have to do it, but sometimes you'll just feel the desire to, and if you do, then it needs to conform to the instructions below on how to write a conclusion. But again, you'll see this is what I mean: introduction, bold-faced heading; summary, bold-faced heading; down below the summary, critique, bold-faced heading. Okay? And then finally, this is college, and this is an upper division class, one of our most demanding upper division classes, and you can't give me papers that have a bunch of typos, grammatical mistakes, etc. The occasional typo, the occasional grammatical mistake, I'm going to overlook that. But if it's just riddled with them, and not necessarily just riddled with them, but if it just has a lot, that's just a red flag. Again, it tells me that you're a sloppy person and that you're going to be giving me sloppy stuff. And even if the quality of the thought is very high for some reason, you're just not going to get credit for it. So you'll notice that this person actually has done okay. There's a typo right here. I mean, Google Docs is telling him that there's a typo. There's a little red line under that. And that's what's going to be telling you too. And again, if you ignore these, or a bunch of these, then I'm not going to be happy with you. Okay, now as far as the basic writing style, and this is just sort of a general requirement for all philosophical essays, don't editorialize unnecessarily. So what we mean by that is essentially just making a lot of side comments that just are essentially filling up the space or trying to show how clever you are. That isn't interesting in a philosophical paper. Don't repeat yourself. Generally, just don't repeat yourself. I qualify it as pointless repetition because there might be a time when you would want to repeat yourself, say, at a different point of the article to remind the reader what you said above. But saying things in multiple times in multiple different ways is really just telling the reader that you don't know how to say things right the first time and that you're not willing to take the time to do that. So remember that in a philosophical paper, nobody gives you any extra points for writing more words. You actually that tends to be a bad thing. We want you to be very concise. We want you to be very precise. And we don't like it when we're having to read more than we should be to get your point across. Of course, don't attack people because of their psychological motives. We're only in philosophy, we only look at people's reasoning. So nothing about the person is interesting to us. Any speculation about the person is not interesting to us. And don't complain about the author's writing style or choice of words or how difficult it was for you to understand. Those may all be true, but they're not interesting things to read about. So don't do that. Okay, so general writing standards, written college English writing standards apply, and you should, I'm not going to go to it, but you should take the time to acquaint yourself with the basic guidelines for writing philosophy papers. Already said it's got to be free of spelling, grammatical, structural errors, etc. important to understand that any essay that begins with errors like this is likely to be dismissed by the reader. That's me, right? So you've got to begin clearly, and if you don't begin well, you're just essentially telling the reader that things are going to get worse. So start off well, and don't begin with any sophomoric kinds of errors. Occasionally those creep in late at night or toward the end of your essay because you're hurrying to get done. But if they're going to be anywhere, they should not be in the beginning of an essay. Okay, so always, always, always write with the aim of making it as easy as possible for the reader to understand and evaluate what you're saying. What that means is, generally speaking, you want to write very short sentences. You should always avoid writing long sentences, and I'm serious about this. If you start counting the words in your sentences and you see that there's over 20 words typically, then there's a really good chance that your sentences are unnecessarily long and confusing. Same holds with long paragraphs. Once they start to get over 12 lines, there's just a really high probability that you've got lost inside your own paragraph and you really don't know what you're trying to accomplish. So anytime you write a sentence, read it and ask yourself if there's any way to express the same thought in fewer words. And the truth is, the answer is it'll probably be yes. And if that's the case, then do it. Again, nothing of value is resulting from you taking more words than is required to express yourself. Of course, always write incomplete sentences, but make sure you avoid things like passive voice and other convoluted constructions. This is a new service, Smart Thinking, just came online this academic year. If you're somebody who struggles with your writing, use this service. It's getting lots of really good reviews. Quotations, if you do quote, you've got to identify it as such. It's a huge, huge, huge error to drop in a quotation as if it's something that you wrote, and that's called plagiarism, and it can disqualify your whole paper, make you receive an F, and if it seems clearly intentional, then you're going to fail the class doing that. So avoid that, of course. Now, in general, in this type of essay, you really shouldn't do hardly any quoting. Minimal use of quotations. The only time you should really quote is if the exact way that the author said something is really important. Otherwise, you should be putting everything in your own words. Okay, now finally, have a good sense of your audience. Your primary reader is me, your instructor, and I, of course, wouldn't be grading this if I haven't read the article in question, but you should approach this assignment as if you intend to publish it in a philosophy journal. And this means that the average reader is going to be sophisticated enough to understand what you are saying, but they're probably not going to have read the article. So you don't want to ever write something that nobody could understand unless they have read the article. So that's a very common criticism of mine. I'll say, if I hadn't read the article, I wouldn't know what you're talking about here because you're not supplying me enough context. Always look at your writing and say, would a person who has not read the article already really understand what I'm saying? Is a very important evaluative criterion. So you're not accountable for summarizing the entire article, of which more below, but you should always refrain from allusions that would only be comprehensible to someone who has read the article already. The other thing to be aware of is that these analyses are partly an opportunity for you to demonstrate that you've been paying attention in class. And so you really should use them to demonstrate an awareness of other relevant readings. If you don't do that, at least do not demonstrate obvious ignorance of the other relevant readings. In other words, don't reproduce criticisms that are made by authors we've read without acknowledging that that's exactly what you're doing. And be careful to include or consider really important criticisms if they're relevant to your project when these things have been a real focus of class discussion. Okay, now talking about just the basic format, we've already mentioned that there's three non-optional sections: the introduction, summary, and critique, which all have to be clearly identified. And you can include a conclusion. There's instructions below for including a conclusion. There's no requirement to, and it doesn't negatively impact your grade, or to have it to not have one, or it doesn't positively impact one to include one. Sometimes you're just going to want to. Okay, now here are the specific instructions for each section. So let's begin by talking about the introduction. So this section must accomplish 2 tasks in this order, and I strongly prefer that you devote a single short paragraph to each task. Okay, so that's getting out of the gates well. These are distinct identifiable tasks, so make them distinct identifiable paragraphs. So the first one, you just identify the article and describe in really just 1 or 2 sentences what problems it addresses and what views it defends. Okay, now the student whose work I've selected to look at, I selected this person because they did an okay job in lots of ways. They ultimately ended up getting like a B or a B plus in the course. There's plenty of errors here that you would recognize yourself and that you might not commit on your own, but it's not intimidatingly good or so poor that it's not useful to you. So you'll see here that he did exactly what I wanted him to do, which is to write 2 distinct paragraphs. The first paragraph identifies the article, right, and the author, and tells me a little bit about the article to really situate me in it and give me a strong sense of what it is that the article is about. And really, even here, there is some focus. You don't notice he has a misspelling right away, which was a bad deal. But you don't have to tell me what the whole article is about. You can really be focusing on the aspect of the article that interests you. But this is a very sort of a general characterization, and it's brief. Like this, even this paragraph is maybe just a little longer than I would like, but it's certainly within bounds. I don't want you to be starting to summarize the article in any detail, because that's what you do in the summary. Now, going back to the second part, what you're going to do is state precisely which aspects of the article you're going to address and precisely what you intend to accomplish. Now, this requirement is really difficult for people initially, and one reason is that they try to do this right away. They try to just write, have the introduction be the thing that they write first, and the reality is that you're going to be in your best possible position to write a good introduction, at least part 2, after you've pretty much finished the article, because then your analysis, because then you can look back and you say, well, what did I really accomplish here? So this section has to commit to doing something, to engaging in some critical project, and then you actually have to do that thing. So you want to establish a lot of coherence, complete coherence between what you say here and the critical project itself. So you can't be vague. It can't be a vague statement like, I'll evaluate the author's views, or I'll show where I agree and where I disagree. It has to be a very specific and concise statement of what you intend to claim and what you intend to discuss critically in the article. Now, lots of really poor introductory level analyses just get off on the wrong foot, and they don't have any critical statement at all. There's sort of a vague characterization that they'll be discussing some aspect of the article, but there's no critical project stated. And if there is no critical project stated, then you will not get anything over a C- or a D on the paper at the very best. So what this person achieved, and this is actually his first analysis in epistemology, he wrote, this author's name is Spicer, I generally agree with Spicer's conclusion. Really never need to say this, by the way. You never need to tell me what you agree with anywhere at all. It's okay, but it's not telling me anything interesting usually. Generally agree with Spicer's conclusion. However, it's not apparently clear. I don't know what he means by apparently, but however, it's not clear what type of data Spicer thinks we need in order to do something. We haven't read the article, so we don't really know. And then he says something specific. I will argue something specific, and I will identify areas that will strengthen the specific conclusion that he mentioned above. So that's good. This is a well-stated, relatively well-stated project. If I go down to another one of his analyses, then I'll see something that's not, the second time he wasn't really that good. So now he's talking about an article by Schwitzgebel. Again, for some reason, he starts out thinking he needs to tell me what he agrees about. I just regard that as filler for the most part. I don't really want to read about that. He says Schwitzgebel seems to focus only on belief and in between belief, in addition to belief and in between belief. I want to say, so I would rather say I will argue. Notice, so it's totally okay to use the word I. No, it's, that's usually a very useful way of making sentences shorter. So if you've ever been told not to use the first person, ignore that when you're writing essays. So he says, I want to say that it's possible for someone to hold some conscious beliefs that contradict with their self-descriptive dispositions. And when this was bad, right, he wrote something ungrammatical, which really irritates me from the beginning. And when we're looking closely, it could be possible to determine, depending on one's dispositions, whether a person does believe something or holds a subconscious belief. Well, I don't really know what he's saying there now. And it's not, I've read the article, but it's just like that sentence just doesn't make much sense. And also, I don't see here a well-described project anymore. As in the previous one, he had actually told me, I'm going to argue this. I'm going to claim this. Those are the kinds of sentences that you look for in introduction. Okay, so as far as the summary is concerned, again, a little bit of repetition here. You've heard this before, but it's not going to hurt to hear it again. For the most part, you should summarize only those aspects of the article that are relevant to your critique. So essentially, I don't want to be reading a bunch of things in your summary that never come up again in anything you say in your critique. So that's part of the selectivity of this. You will need to avoid the very strong temptation to just start writing about what's going in the article without any kind of idea about why you're telling me about it. There's an essential link between the critique and the summary in this sense. So if you summarize any more than that, it should only be because anything less would not provide the reader an adequate understanding of the author's basic concerns. So it's not that you can't summarize anything that you don't deal with, but there should be a really good reason for telling me about it if you're not going to be critical about it. And also really resist the temptation to write a really long, detailed summary of the whole article. That's not what this is about. And I know that this is going to be a strong temptation, especially when you struggle to find a critical angle. But if you do this, then you should just be aware that you're not going to be rewarded for it. In fact, you'll be penalized for it. So as a general rule of thumb, the summary and critique should be about equally long. That's a very general rule. It's not an absolute rule at all. Sometimes you can make really excellent, short, trenchant criticisms so that the critique section will be smaller than the summary. But the novice paper, which involves the novice mistake, is a sprawling narrative summary with really a critique that is just more summary, and that's something you need to avoid as well. When you're summarizing, you are not critiquing. These have distinct functions. So, which is what I'm saying here in section 2, the summary must present the author's views in the best possible light. So you've got to be trying your very hardest to represent what the author is saying in a thorough, fair, and completely accurate way. So any kind of misrepresentation, especially misrepresentation that facilitates a bogus critique, is going to be really, really heavily penalized. And number 3, emphasize something very important. You don't do any criticism whatsoever in the critique. You don't make any critical comments in the summary of any kind. The summary summarizes. The point of view you want to have is in the summary, you want to be the author's friend. You want to say, I want to get this author exactly right. I want to say exactly what she is trying to get across, and maybe I can even do it better than they did if that would help to make their case stronger. So it's a very important philosophical skill to give generous interpretations of what somebody is saying. And then finally, the summary needs to be organized logically, not chronologically. And this, again, is one of the most common mistakes. People who don't really have a project in mind or have an idea of what they're trying to accomplish will just write a narrative summary. And the cues for the narrative summary are very, very clear. The writing style is always, first the author says this, then the author says that. Then they go on to say this, and they mention, don't use the word mention ever. Mention is a very poor word to use in a philosophical analysis. They mention this, and then finally they say this. That's a narrative flow. This is not a story, right? You're looking at a particular position. You don't care where or what, or in what order they say things. What you care about is a logical exposition. So what I write is that this means that depending on the organization of the article itself, a single paragraph from the summary might contain statements that are made in very different places in the article. That's not a requirement, but that would be a perfectly legitimate expectation. The summary itself should be organized in a way that makes the author's views make sense. Under no conditions are you to simply relate what the author says the way that she says them. The summary that goes something like, the author begins by discussing, then she goes on to say, then, etc., is just a train wreck of a summary. Now, in fact, if we go back to this person's summary, you'll find, again, it's his very first one. This is partly, he actually does a pretty good job in his first summary. Excuse me, we're not on his first summary. Let's look at his first summary here. Okay, so what I wrote is, your summary is clear enough, but you're doing what no summary should do, and that is convey what is stated in the article in a narrative way. In other words, first the author says this, etc. So this very common comment of mine. He recovered from this. Like I said, he ended up doing pretty well in the class, but even after having read this, how to do things, this is all he could come up to do. So if you look at this, he says, Spicer begins his analysis by this. There's no reason to tell me how an essay begins. How it begins is not important to me, or to the reader in any way. And then you can see that he is always focusing on what happens afterwards in the article. Spicer next considers the notion of contextualism. So when he's writing in this way, I can tell next, Spicer says this. Spicer later explains how. When you write a summary like this, I can tell right away that you don't have a project in mind, that you're just basically saying, well, let me just write, I've read this article, let me just write a bunch of stuff about it, and then maybe I'll think about something useful I can say critically. And that's not how you want to, if you want to begin your summary this way, if you want to write it down yourself that way, just to get things going in a draft, that's no problem at all. But that's not what a finished summary looks like. A finished summary has the logical form, expositional form that we've talked about, not the narrative form. Okay, now finally, we can talk about how to do a good critique. Okay, so first of all, your critique should be organized in a way that at least roughly reflects the structure of your summary. So this is impossible if you've just written a narrative summary. But if you've selected your summary with an eye to writing the critique, then this will happen pretty naturally. Now, what most people say when they are challenged to write a critique of a challenging paper is they essentially have this feeling. They said, "Look, I just don't know enough to be critical. I don't feel like I'm in a position to be critical of a professional article in philosophy." Well, that's fine. That shows a certain amount of humility and realism. But what you need to understand about a critique is that it's not something that is designed to refute the article. You may, for the most part, think that you may find yourself really utterly convinced by the article, but you can still develop a critical perspective by seeing how it could be improved, how it could make the case stronger, or even just by posing questions that maybe you think can actually be pretty well answered, but which weren't necessarily well answered or as well answered in the article. So there are several different ways of approaching a critique, and we've identified 3 of them here. There's others, but these are the main ones. So the first one can be to define your project in terms of arguments and views that you really find problematic. In other words, often you do have a substantial basis of disagreement. And then in your critique, you show how the author's conclusion does not follow, either because the author's reasons are false, or the author's reasoning is mistaken, or the author has failed to make other important considerations that tend to undermine the conclusion, or perhaps because there are just some serious kinds of unclarities that prevent you from knowing precisely what the person is saying. Now, now if you don't have that particular perspective on the article, which, as I already said, is quite common, you can define your project in terms of arguments and views that you actually pretty much agree with. And that if you did this, then in your critique, you'll consider ways in which the author's views might still be reasonably criticized. In other words, you take the point of view of someone else who is being critical of these, and then you attempt to strengthen the author's position by showing how these criticisms can actually be met. Now, the easiest way to do this, frankly, and this isn't always possible because sometimes I've chosen an article that where you're just not going to be able to find anything, but sometimes you'll be able to go online or into library resources and find responses to this very article. And you can, so you can educate yourself a little bit more widely. There's no requirement to do this on my analyses. You don't have to go looking at outside sources, but sometimes that can be an extremely helpful way of one, developing a critical project according to the first method, but also finding out what other people have said about the article. Now, again, like I say, sometimes that's not possible because the article hasn't attracted a great deal of attention, but that's something that might aid you in doing things in this way. Now, finally, the last one we identify is to define your project in terms of arguments and views that you find interesting, but which you're currently disinclined to either fully accept or fully reject. Again, a very, very common and reasonable perspective to have. Now, when you do this, what you're going to try to do is articulate the strongest considerations in favor of the view and the strongest considerations against the view, and then explain why you think that a sort of state of indecision is sort of the reasonable perspective here. So you're still engaging in a critical perspective in the sense that you are providing what you take to be strong reasons for doubt and strong reasons for support, but then you're just arriving at a more moderate position. Now, I haven't written this down, but it's the overwhelmingly most common mistake in doing a critique is to spend a paragraph saying what it is that you agree with. And this is, I'm not sure if this person made this particular mistake. Let me see if I can, no, not here. Now, so he was actually pretty good at avoiding this. Well, here, there isn't a general prohibition against saying anything that you agree with, especially in a conclusion, which I haven't talked about yet. But it's okay in a conclusion to identify specific areas of agreement. And in general, it's okay to signal agreement. But the main problem with a critique is that focuses on agreement is that it simply agreeing, writing a paragraph that tells me all of the things that you think are really good about the article, that doesn't belong there. I don't want to hear all of the things that you agree with that you don't have anything critical to say about. Now, if you're going to go ahead and actually be critical of the things that you find yourself agreeing with, that's fine. But just don't think that you've done anything useful in a critique by identifying things that you agree with, and don't think that you've done a critique if all you've done is provided me further summary. So again, one of my more common criticisms of beginning analyses is this is not a critique. This is just an extension of your summary. Okay, so again, if you look at this person's analyses, what you find is in each case there is a very substantial attempt at a critique. And for example, here in his third, by the time he reaches his third analysis, what we're seeing is he's really codifying his criticisms, specifically even identifying them as first and his second and his third criticisms, and showing exactly where it is that he agrees and disagrees with the things that the aspects of the article that he summarized. Okay, so the final point here is that you can write a conclusion. If you do write a conclusion, the most important thing to remember is that you don't say anything new. In other words, don't bring any new information, don't include any new claims, don't include any new criticisms. Anything new should have been said above. So when you're concluding, you're basically just summarizing what it is that you think that you have achieved in the article for the benefit of the reader. Okay, now it's very useful to finish. I won't do this here, but it's very useful to go ahead and read the sample analysis. Again, unfortunately, probably an article you haven't read, but this is a student sample analysis that, it's not perfect, but it's one that would get an A in an upper division course, and it achieves all of the things that we've been talking about in a very an admirable and clear and concise manner. Okay, so strongly advise that you spend a little time with that and try to make it so that when you, even on your first attempt, you try to produce something that has the feel of this analysis. Okay, that's it.